Fishing high tide and low tide now, because I know a lot of y'all are pretty curious of which one is better to fish. Typically, a low tide, if you're doing marsh fishing, is better just because the fish they're not really spread out. They're real concentrated, and they really have nowhere to run. Um, I don't have a paddle, but if you put a paddle on the water and the blade is barely out of the water, that's pretty much the perfect depth you want to fish for side casting. You know, you put your paddle down if the blade's just coming out of the water, that's when you want to start looking for fish. Anything too higher than that makes it a little tougher. So typically right about here, which seems pretty shallow, but if you're looking for redfish, that's the easiest way to do it. But low tide, they can also cause a lot of problems too. As y'all know, if you fish a lot of marshes with oyster, you're typically going to leave a lot of plastic behind in the marsh, just because some places it's avoidable not to hit the oyster. And also, it kind of gives your stealth away too, because when you're paddling through a marsh, your bottom of your kayak's hitting oyster and your paddle's hitting oyster, so you're scaring everything within, I say, 20 to 30 yards as soon as you hit that oyster. I tell a lot of people though, when they're paddling for redfish, if you can, and it's not oyster on the bottom, don't paddle water, stick your blade in the mud and push yourself along instead of actually hitting the water. Because if you're trying to paddle in water that's that deep, you're not going to be able to get that much momentum doing that. Just push yourself. It's a lot stealthier and actually move a lot quicker. High tide is also, I like high tide fishing too, because it makes the fishing, I'd say, easier sometimes, because the methods of catching fish in high water are a lot simpler than trying to side cast them. So when it's high water, the popping cork works really good, because say that you have a shell bottom, the water is going to be, typically 2 to 3 feet higher than the shell. So you want to rig a popping cork just like this. So I'd say your bait's that far off the ground. This is a mid-coast popper. It's a funny story. When I first moved here and I started fishing a lot of tournaments, I do decently good, but the guys that are winning first, second, third place, all they use is a popping cork and gulp. I'd have to say it's the #1 redfish lure out there by far. It's not the funnest way to catch fish, but it's probably the most effective way to catch fish. And a lot of people, they make the mistake, and when they work a popping cork, they work it like it's a live shrimp, which it just doesn't work like that. It's a weighted popping cork, so when you work it, you want it to keep in one area, and it's going to draw that fish to that area instead of working a lot of water and getting away from it. Also, when I pop it, I pop it almost as hard as I can every time and count 2 to 5 seconds, because you really want to make a big explosion. If you're fishing with a buddy and you pop it and he looks over and he thinks a redfish it just exploded, you're doing it the right way. This is another cork. It's by Bomber. It's a good cork. I don't like that it doesn't have a lot of weight to it, but the wire on it won't bend. Like on a mid-coast, they're probably only good for, I'd say, 3 trips max before the wire starts to bend and they just become no good. But this will never bend, but you can cast this one further. And then high tides, of course, top water is also another good effective way to catch fish on a high tide. It's really hard to catch fish on a top water on a low tide, just because it just scares them. The water's so low that anything loud is going to scare the fish. But that's when this bait right here comes in handy. When the tide's real low, just throw this bait over shallow shell, and I've caught everything. I've caught trout, I've caught flounder, I've caught drum, I've had sheep's head hit it, I've caught redfish off this lure. It's an all-around good lure to fish, shallow water. And then, of course, on the high tide, you'll notice that the fish, they like to push back deep into the grass. I'm sure y'all have been paddling and you've heard them explode back in the grass, and you really can't do much about it, except, throw this popping cork. For example, if you're looking straight down the shoreline, you want to get directly next to it and throw the popping cork straight down the grass as close as you can to it. Just pop it as hard as you can, and typically it draws the redfish out to the cork and you'll catch them. But it's one of the few ways you can catch them. I've seen people, they rig weedless plastics and just rip it through the grass, but I haven't had much luck with that.